Okay, take a break from singing to read another chapter of American Horrors, Essays on the Modern American Horror Film. The next chapter, chapter 3, is an essay called Seeing is Believing, The Exorcist and Don't Look Now, written by Marcia Kinder and Beverly Houston. About the authors, Marcia Kinder and Beverly Houston's comparative study of The Exorcist and Don't Look Now is an edited but not updated version of an essay that first appeared in 1974 in Cinema. Relying on close textual analysis of narrative structure and visual style, Kinder and Houston argue that both The Exorcist and Don't Look Now foreground the problem of interpretation. Though these two films differ in their depiction of metaphysical values and spiritual reality, we can now see that the necessity of interpretation by characters and spectators alike, and the precise meanings of representing the supernatural and paranormal would prove to be of central importance in the many post-1974 films of demonic possession, Carrie and Demon, and psychic horror, The Changeling and The Dead Zone. Kinder and Houston are co-authors of Close Up, a critical perspective on film and self and cinema. Houston is Director of Critical Studies in the School of Cinema Television, University of Southern California, Los Angeles, and is co-editor of the Quarterly Review of Film Studies. Her most recent publications include articles on television spectatorship and cinema melodrama. Kinder is Professor of Critical Studies in the School of Cinema Television, University of Southern California. She is a founding editor of DreamWorks and is on the editorial board of Film Quarterly and other film journals. Audiences have abandoned Watergate realism to follow movies into other worlds. In Los Angeles and New York, huge crowds wait to see William Friedkin's The Exorcist, a big-budget Hollywood shocker. Britain's Nicholas Roeg may have his first U.S. commercial success with the occult Don't Look Now, while his earlier intriguing works, Performance and Walkabout, remain only cult favorites. The popularity of these films suggests that new kinds of belief and morality may be rushing in to replace the almost intolerable decadence, corruption, and cynicism that currently mark our national experience. In a spirit of self-protection, it behooves us to see what is being offered. Both Don't Look Now and The Exorcist reject the assumptions of most other recent horror films. They deny psychological explanations of the supernatural and accept the metaphysical nature of good and evil. Their most important precursor is Roman Polanski's Rosemary's Baby. Despite its playful self-reflexiveness, Rosemary's corrupted husband is an actor, and his demonic cohorts look like characters from old horror films. Polanski's devil is an external force, a reality in the metaphysical organization of the universe, who cannot be explained away. As in Don't Look Now, the silliness of the demonic killers in no way lessens their capacity for evil. The visual style of Rosemary's Baby also draws attention to the objects, colors, textures, and surfaces of the environment rather than leading to symbolic interpretations. The concrete nature of the data raises questions about belief. What kind of empirical evidence is necessary to validate an expanded view of reality or to prove the existence of the devil? As in The Exorcist, the devil is presented in fully Christian context, involving Christ and organized religion, but with one important difference. The birth of Rosemary's devil child parodies the birth of Christ, an ironic complication that obscures the clear antagonism between good and evil. In The Exorcist, there is no such confusion. Christ is the enemy of the devil and the only opponent capable of vanquishing the evil one. Don't Look Now acknowledges that there is an external power that is dangerous and unknowable and possibly responsible for modern ambiguity and complexity. Though the world is in a desperate situation, the film suggests that the only fruitful attitude is to keep in touch with what is valuable in the past while remaining open to new modes for the future, especially the possibility of expanded consciousness and perception. Rogue infuses the film with the radical chic of the late 1960s and early 1970s, a perspective rarely seen in horror films. In contrast, The Exorcist denies the complexity and desperation by externalizing the evil and locating it handily in one mythic figure, the Christian devil, who is presented as vulgar, limited, and preoccupied with sex. Offered as a reactionary social corrective, he becomes in the film responsible for all modern evil. Once we recognize this and call on the church and traditional morality, we can cast him out and make everything good again. Perhaps the ease of this solution lies at the heart of the film's popularity. The Exorcist, 1973. As a special effects movie, The Exorcist is extremely successful. Its power to terrify is largely based on makeup and sound effects. You see before your own eyes a 12-year-old child transformed into a yellow-eyed, thick-lipped, scarred and growling monster who spews out jets of bright green bile. Plastic molds were made of Linda Blair's body to increase the authenticity of one of the devil's and Friedkin's best tricks. He turns the child's head around 360 degrees on her neck. The soundtrack is extremely loud, providing a cacophony of noises that keeps the audience tense and edgy. The devil's poundings, the clanging hammers of the archaeological dig, the city noises, the loud thud of punching bag and tennis balls, the roaring subway train, the intolerable screech of the medical instruments. But most astonishing of all, the child's mouth opens and, through the wonders of modern technology, out comes a string of voices, from Mercedes McCambridge's guttural devil through the whining accents of the priest's mother, a series of languages including Greek, Latin, French, and gibberish, and, with terrifying effect, the wheezing and roaring growls of some huge monster beast. The power of these effects lies in the fact that we see and hear for ourselves, which is precisely dramatized in the confrontation between the mother, Chris MacNeil, played by Ellen Burstyn, and the doctors. In controlled voices of reason, they try to diagnose these terrifying phenomena as pathological states and accelerated motor performance. Refusing to have her perceptions invalidated, the distraught mother cuts through their jargon screaming, "What are you talking about? Jesus Christ, did you see her? Did you see?" Later, when a battery of doctors finally has to suggest exorcism, they try to lessen their discomfort with rational explanation. It works only because the patient believes he's possessed, purely by force of suggestion. Again, Chris cuts through the verbal screen. "You're telling me that I should take my daughter to a witch doctor, is that it?" The language of the film contrasts with the powerful visual and sound effects that confront us directly. Like the doctors, William Blatty and Friedkin use language to attempt a symbolic inflation. Most of the characters' names have obvious associations. Regan, Lear's daughter, the ungrateful child sharper than a serpent's tooth. Chris MacNeil, Christ, father, Damien Karras, who is charitable like his namesake Saint Damien, but who ends up possessed by the demon. Burke, to murder by suffocating, to suppress quietly, who is murdered by Regan. Father Marin, preserving ancient orthodoxy and ritual like the Maronite Catholics. Sharon, referred to as Cher, who shares the horror. Lieutenant Kinderman, protector of children and childlike man. Father Dyer, who is dying inside, reborn through Damien's sacrifice. As Father Dyer walks down the street in the final scene, a sign reading Prospect Avenue appears over his shoulder. The gratuitous allusions to Body and Soul and Othello, as well as the name of the inner movie Crash Course, are equally heavy-handed. They are probably introduced as allegory or because self-reflexiveness is currently chic. Bloody script is full of banalities. Mrs. McNeil, the problem with your daughter is not her bed, it's her brain. In developing the film's anti-language position, director and screenwriter failed to solve an admittedly difficult problem: how to develop this negative attitude in language that does not also fail aesthetically. In contrast to these other techniques, they succeed with Father Merrin's silence. In the archaeological dig in northern Iraq, Father Merrin is the dominant figure and there is practically no dialogue. He's the archetypal silent man, and we recognize him from genres like the Western, frequently starring Gary Cooper, Clint Eastwood, or Steve McQueen. Instead of talking, he acts. As Merrin says in the last line of the opening sequence, "There's something I must do." He is contrasted with Father Karras, whose wit and intellectuality manifest the devil's wicked tongue, which Karras has developed at Harvard, Bellevue, Johns Hopkins, places like that. Chris McNeil is even more blatantly linked to the devil through her incessant cursing and blaspheming. "Circumstances, my ass. He doesn't give a shit. I've been on this fucking line for 20 minutes. Jesus Christ." During the exorcism sequence, Father Merrin will not listen to Karras's background of the case, and he warns Damien to avoid conversations with the demon. The devil is a liar. Indeed, throughout the film, the language is the devil's instrument, and Friedkin and Blatty succeed in developing his verbal prowess. As the film denies the explanatory power of language, so are the conventional sources of emotional identification denied in character development. Pauline Kael points out, "We in the audience don't feel bad when the saintly Father Merrin dies. We don't even feel a pang of sympathy when the words 'help me' appear on Reagan's body. There is no indication that Blatty or Friedkin has any feeling for the little girl's helplessness and suffering or her mother's. The basic situation and the tone of psychological realism provide the potential for strong sympathy, but Blatty and Friedkin choose not to develop it. They present us with data for a psychological interpretation: divorce, Reagan's jealousy of Burke, the father's rejection of Reagan, her forthcoming 13th birthday, unusual physical contact between mother and daughter. Then they reject it in favor of a phenomenological devil. We don't care about Reagan's terrible decline. Our only reactions are curiosity and a delicious terror, for which we are carefully trained. Every time the camera goes upstairs and looks at Reagan's doorway, we get turned on, anticipating the expensive horrors that will follow. The basic structure of the film is designed to draw us into the exorcism. Divided into 3 parts, the film's organization itself suggests a ritual pattern. These segments roughly parallel 3 of Northrop Frye's phases of symbolism and modes of power, to be developed later. The opening segment, set in northern Iraq, presents us with phenomena that evade rational explanation, but are powerfully effective at another level. Framed by the opening and closing images of a sun glowing over an empty landscape, the events at the archaeological dig create an ominous tension, primarily through the way they are presented. The emphasis is on movement. The camera pans, zooms in and out, assumes odd positions, tracks with or against the movements of people. The film cuts abruptly between interior and exterior, close-up and long shot, light and dark, and on the site and in the marketplace. The workers dig and hammer in a kind of unison, creating incantory rhythms. The soundtrack is dominated by a strange combination of powerful sounds that, despite their highly rhythmical quality, create a sense of confusion. Religious chanting, the banging of the tools, the murmur of voices, the loud ticking clock, the rattling of the carriage, the snarling of dogs, and, intermittently throughout, the strange electronic music. The sense of mystery is heightened by the sparse dialogue in a foreign language. The few fragments that we can understand take on greater significance, which is inexplicable till later in the film. Strange, not of the period. Evil against evil. There is something I must do. We have a similar response to many of the visual images, though at this point in the film we do not yet understand their symbolic meaning. They still have the power to make us uneasy. Eyes, both blind and staring, the circle images of the sun, the woman looking down menacingly from above, the strange amulet from another period, the demonic statue, the growling, fighting animals, Father Merrin's pillbox and his near death from the carriage. Finally, the development of mysterious significance grows more self-conscious at the end of this opening segment. With great purposefulness, Father Merrin returns to the dig. After a moment of danger before the Arab guards identify him, he climbs up to a high point where the huge demonic statue stands out in sharp relief against the orange sky. The camera examines its face and pulls back to a longer shot of the hilltop, and strange things happen. The wind begins to blow and become the weird electronic music. Rocks roll down the hill behind him. A mysterious old Arab watches intently, and suddenly two dogs begin a horrible growling fight. Finally, the camera reveals Father Merrin positioned opposite the demonic statue with a great orange sun between them, foreshadowing their adversary relationship that is to dominate part 3 of the film. Whereas the opening segment was developed through a phenomenological mode, emphasizing perception without interpretation, the second part shifts to a more familiar kind of melodrama that combines psychological realism and gothic horror. This mixture goes all the way back to Caligari and Nosferatu. In Fry's terms, the shift is from the ironic mode, where images are presented directly through simple juxtaposition, to the mimetic mode, where they function as similes or analogies. This is the part of the film where we are teased with psychology, but the facile explanations characteristic of this mode are ultimately rejected. We are frightened not through direct apprehension of unexplained phenomena, but through conscious manipulation of conventions from the horror film. Every film buff knows that noises in the attic and candles that blow out mysteriously cannot be explained by rats. As in most films of this genre, we are most surprised by our first look at the monster, our hero or heroine transformed by inspired makeup. Like the dreams in Caligari and Rosemary's Baby, Damien's dream develops 2 dimensions: the psychological realism of his guilt about his mother, and his supernatural awareness of images from the first segment, the amulet, the black dog, and the timepiece. When Regan is subjected to the spinal tap and x-rays, the huge, clanking, flashing equipment is strongly reminiscent of Frankenstein's laboratory and various Gothic torture instruments. In the same sequence, a needle inserted in her neck brings forth a stream of blood that must excite both Dracula and his fans. This attack on science is part of a larger condemnation of sophisticated, decadent, bourgeoisie culture, which we also remember from Rosemary's Baby. The second section begins with a dissolve from the powerful, primitive image at the dig to a bridge in the big city, establishing the context in which all the intractable modern evils are to be mechanically catalogued: poverty in the New York slums, sordid subways, overcrowded hospitals and asylums, loneliness of the old, casual acceptance of swearing, liquor, drugs, and divorce, campus violence and the media that exploit it, a leftover Nazi butchering pig in Chris's kitchen, and at the center of the film lie the faithlessness and decadence of the enlightened clergy. Even Father Damien, the best we have, has lost faith and wants to leave the order. The decadence is epitomized by Father Dyer's vision of the heavenly city, a solid white nightclub with me as headliner for all eternity, and they love me. This modern world is explored by intercutting between 2 parallel plots. Chris McNeil, a rich, famous movie star, is having troubles with her two-faced daughter. Poor Father Damien is torn between loyalties to 2 mothers, the church, and his earthly mother who is dying in poverty. The McNeil's materialism and his spiritualism are both beset by soullessness and mental illness. The last sequence creates a transition between parts 2 and 3. Whereas part 2 has formally cut between the McNeils and Father Damien, who are not united until part 3, this final sequence cross-cuts between Lieutenant Kinderman and Chris McNeil as they make parallel discoveries. For example, she discovers the cross under Reagan's pillow. He finds Reagan's clay sculpture at the foot of the stairs, and unites them as they both tell lies. He pretends the autograph is for his daughter. She lies to prevent him from seeing Reagan. In the end, they move toward the same conclusion. Friedkin complicates the inevitability with a bit of heavy-handed irony. The facts force Kinderman to conclude that Burke Dennings was killed by a very powerful man, while we in the audience watch Chris catching up with what we already know about Reagan's guilt. Like Father Merrin and the demonic statue at the end of the first part, Kinderman and McNeil are established as adversaries. In the secular urban context, good versus evil has become cop versus suspect. When Kinderman leaves, Chris runs to her daughter's room to find objects flying through the air, and Reagan masturbating or mutilating herself with a bloody cross. Forcing Chris's head down between her legs, she screams, "Lick me, lick me," when Reagan turns her head around 360 degrees for the first time and sends the Bureau after her mother. This is the turning point. We know, beyond the shadow of a doubt, that a psychological explanation is no longer possible. Part 3 focuses on the exorcism. The shift from Part 2 to 3 is not as abrupt as the move from northern Iraq to Georgetown. We are not confronted with different characters in a new setting with a shift in style. Rather, we gain a different perspective on the same phenomena. In place of the psychological explanation from the mimetic Part 2, we now see through the eyes of Christian mythology. In Fry's terms, we have entered the mythic mode, or anagogic phase, where symbols represent identity and action takes the form of ritual. But instead of moving directly from irony to myth, which Fry describes as the characteristic pattern in 20th century art, the film regresses backward through the mimetic mode to express its reactionary vision. Reagan is no longer acting like a devil. She is the devil. When Father Damien takes communion, the traditional water is not to be interpreted as a symbol for Christ. It is Christ's body, and wine is his blood. As viewers, we believe in the devil, and by implication, in Christ, because of what we see and hear. For example, Reagan's bed floats several feet above the ground. But, paradoxically, true faith requires rejection of our senses, as Father Merrin warns Karras that the devil lies and creates illusions. The exorcism also brings together all the plot strands and creates apparent complexity for the sake of full resolution. Details of the first two parts, Merrin versus the statue, the ominous carriage, the pills, the fighting dogs, the devil's tricks, the social corruption, etc., develop their full meaning as they are shown to be part of the basic metaphysical dichotomy between good and evil, Christ and the devil. Part 3 opens as Chris and Father Karras meet on a bridge, the same transitional image that opened Part 2. As she involves him in exorcising Reagan, we realize that his plotline from Part 2, developing his guilt about his mother, provides him with a psychological handicap that makes him vulnerable to the devil. He is contrasted with Father Merrin, whose weakness is physical, old age, heart trouble. And with Father Merrin comes clarification of many ideas and images from Part 1. Into his wooded retreat comes a young priest, like the boy who carries the message at the dig, with a letter that Merrin simply puts in his pocket, as if he knows its contents full well. We begin to suspect that he left Iraq because he knew The devil was waiting for their next confrontation. Bringing back another technique not used since part 1, the film dissolves from Father Merrin in the woods to the new face of his old adversary. Regan's distorted image takes over the whole screen in a huge close-up and defines Merrin's task. Her face dissolves into a classic Gothic image, carrying a small black case. A black-clad stranger, Father Merrin, descends from a cab in the foggy night. Even though it is clearly suggested that the Church has the power to unify all aspects of the experience and give them meaning, there is still a conflict between the old and new within the order. Merrin relies on church ritual, whereas Father Karras' power lies in human interaction. Though we see him move toward renewal of faith during the exorcism, his psychological weaknesses do not allow him to use the traditional weapons. But when Chris asks him, "Is she gonna die?" he gains new determination, draws the devil to himself, and saves Regan through personal sacrifice. In this way, like Caligari, he takes on the triple identity of priest, psychiatrist, and demon. The film's final shift takes place in the brief epilogue after the devil has been and gone. It opens with a cut to the stairs where Father Karras died. They are now empty, silent, revealing no trace of what has happened. As she prepares to drive away with her mother, Regan, who is said to remember nothing, suddenly stares at Father Dyer's collar and reaches up to kiss him, showing that her unconscious knows for all time whence her help cometh. As he walks away, the camera pulls back for a prospect shot, suggesting that life will begin again with new knowledge of the devil, as earlier transitions foreshadowed events to come. As Regan's bruises heal, we have a moment to reflect on the nature of the devil, who is making so much money on the comeback trail. First of all, his powers are extremely limited, confined mostly to simple acts of levitation and teleportation. When he magically slides a drawer in and out of the bed table, Karras tempts him to repeat his trick. He replies, in a parody of Christ at Gethsemane, that this would be a vulgar display of power. But the point is, the devil cannot transform the world through his own power, whereas Christ could but would not. Instead, the devil must rely on his victim's weaknesses. Dennings drank too much, Karras had psychological problems, Merrin was physically weak, and Regan had the vulnerability of the child, complicated by her incipient adolescence. The incident on which the novel is said to be based actually involved a boy, but the sex change also introduces the dimension of woman as the weaker vessel. Genesis teaches that Satan gets to men through their emotional sympathies for the weaker sex. Regan, Chris, and Mother Karras all make demands on Damien and increase his vulnerability to the devil. With his real power so limited, the devil must be frustrated. Stripped of all his glamour, he is extremely noisy, disgustingly messy, and unwholesomely concerned with sex. But even here, he is provincial. Far more limited than Marquis de Sade or William Burroughs. The worst insult he can fling at the priests is that they or their relatives commit acts of oral and anal sex. But the film grants him wide domain, implying that the Christian interpretation of the cosmic order is universally true. This devil has reared his head in Iraq and Africa, where Father Merrin performed an exorcism some years ago, and in Washington, D.C. He is real for Catholics, all the priests, atheists, Chris and family, and Jews, Lieutenant Kinderman. He also provides excellent grounds for anti-intellectuality in the Babel that characterizes science and the arts in this film, confirming the belief of many that this stuff is, indeed, the devil's work. He is presented as the cause of all the social ills catalogued earlier in the film. We do not have to solve or even worry about urban poverty, spiritual death, or corruption in the highest places. Instead, we are taught to fear all irreverence, unconventionality, rebellion, and complex sexuality. Don't Look Now, 1973. Don't Look Now takes a radical view of the supernatural. Instead of retreating to a Manichaean vision of good and evil like The Exorcist, it challenges the basic polarities defined by our rational dualistic culture: life, death, present, future, sacred, profane, ordinary, bizarre, good, evil, true, false, real, imagined, normal, crazy. Like R.D. Laing, Carlos Castaneda, Norman O'Brown, and Doris Lessing, in this film, Rogue accepts expanded consciousness and powers of telepathy, suggesting, as in performance, that nothing is true, everything is permitted. In Don't Look Now, the hero finally accepts his second sight, but the delay ensures misinterpretation and he forfeits his life. Rogue's style makes a similar demand on the audience to expand their vision, providing an implicit affirmation of non-ordinary reality as a source of power. Based on the story by Daphne du Maurier, the film follows a modern couple, John, Donald Sutherland, and Laura Baxter, Julie Christie, to Venice after the death of their little daughter. In Venice, they meet two middle-aged Scottish sisters, Wendy, Celia Matania, who is dumpy and ordinary, and Heather, Hilary Mason, who is blind and psychic. These two women convey contradictory qualities that are held in tension throughout many aspects of the film. They appear mundane and ordinary, like the familiar British women who travel the continent, but, like the weird sisters in Macbeth, at the same time they convey a sense of ominous mystery, which is enhanced through multiple mirror images in our first encounter with them, and strengthened later through a sudden cut to the two sisters laughing wickedly. Heather claims to have established contact with the Baxters' dead daughter, Christine, who is trying to warn her parents to leave Venice. She also affirms that John, too, has second sight. John and Laura react very differently to their encounter with expanded reality. She is established in the opening scene as a seeker of new knowledge as she consults a book beyond the fragile geometry of space to answer her daughter's question, if the world is round, why is the frozen pond flat? John, who is about to have a clairvoyant flash, answers with the aphorism, nothing is what it seems. A few minutes later, in a slide of the interior of a cathedral that John is examining, a patch of red appears, which grows into a shape like a blood stain. If we and John look closely, we can discern that this stain is growing out of a red hooded cape worn by a small figure seated in the cathedral, who, at the end of the film, will become John's murderer. But John interprets only one aspect of the warning correctly. Growing suddenly frightened, he rushes outside to find that his daughter, wearing her red mackintosh, has drowned in the pond. After the first encounter with the two sisters, Laura, who does not have second sight, is convinced that Heather has actually made the contact with Christine's spirit and is restored to health and vitality by this knowledge. Not having recognized his own powers, John is skeptical, yet he is impressed by Laura's improvement, which he can perceive in her face and voice. He offers a second aphorism, seeing is believing, which apparently contradicts his earlier assertion that nothing is what it seems. Later, when John and Laura get lost in the alleys of Venice, John has another clairvoyant experience in which he sees the red-coated figure and he hears a sigh and a scream. Laura sees nothing but is frightened, though still dominated by curiosity. What on earth was that? John, the seer, denies his vision, claiming it is a cat or a rat. Maybe it was only my imagination. Leading her back to the main street, he reassures her, it's okay, I found the real world. Thus, John again ignores the foreshadowings of his own death, the sight, and the murderer, interpreting his perception as unreal. In the next encounter with the sisters, while Laura is eagerly trying to make contact with Christine, Heather tells her that John has the gift. That's what the child is trying to talk to him, even if he doesn't know it, even if he's rejecting it. It's a curse as well as a gift. Another important paradox in the film. As they are talking, the film cuts to John, who almost falls while unveiling a gargoyle high on the church facade. The sequence evokes the previous church, where the Baxters narrowly missed running into the sisters, and foreshadows John's fall in the cathedral, which is to occur soon after. After the séance, John and Laura again argue. She is convinced that the sisters are right in warning John that there is danger while they remain in Venice. John, who has been drinking, suddenly gets sick and must throw up. Ironically, upon his return, he tries to convince Laura that she is sick and should resume taking her pills. Verbally, she accepts, and then she hides the pills. When a phone call comes and they learn that their son has had an accident at his school, Laura interprets this as a validation of the prophecy. This is it. They were right, you see. John facilitates her departure without accepting the supernatural interpretation. But as his skepticism begins to waver soon after, when his scaffold breaks and he almost falls to his death in the cathedral. Afterward, the bishop remarks, "My father was killed in a fall." And John, badly shaken, replies, It's unbelievable. My wife warned me that I was in danger." The bishop confirms, "I wish I didn't have to believe in prophecy, but I do." The irony intensifies here as John moves toward belief, but grasps at this event as the whole truth, still denying that it is one more link in the chain connecting him with the red-hooded figure and death in Venice. John is presented with these linking visions in the very next scene, where he chances upon the body of a murdered victim being raised from the canal against an out-of-focus red background. He immediately flashes back to his own fall and to the image of his daughter rising out of the pond. John now intends to leave Venice, but is prevented by his next clairvoyant experience. Laura, dressed in black, and the two sisters pass by on a hearse boat with a casket, moving slowly down the Grand Canal. Again, as in the opening, he recognizes the danger, but interprets it partially, responding to its immediate shock, while failing to recognize that it is a vision of the future. Concluding that Laura, who is supposed to be in England with their son, has been kidnapped by the two sisters, he goes to the police. When he finally calls and finds that Laura is indeed safe in England, he and Laura reverse positions. He tries to explain his vision, while she is totally involved in the ordinary and mundane, confirming that he must meet her at the airport. Confronted with the fact that there is no natural explanation for his vision, he still refuses to acknowledge his second sight or the danger it implies. Instead, he shifts his attention to the sisters, focusing on his guilt over Heather's arrest. These feelings lead directly to his death. When he finally encounters the red-hooded figure in the dark Venice streets, he interprets her as a child in need and moves in to help her, calling, "I'm a friend, I won't hurt you." Not until the dwarf turns on him and cuts his throat does he accept his second sight, which is revealed through the chain of images that passes before his eyes. This belated acceptance is made quite explicit in the Du Maurier story. And he saw the vaporetto with Laura and the two sisters, and he knew why they were together and for what sad purpose they had come. And, oh God, he thought, what a bloody, silly way to die. Rogue adds a final scene emphasizing the contrast between John's resistance and Laura's acceptance. Recreating John's vision, the hearse vaporetto passes down the canal as Laura stands with a calm smile on her face, her eyes blank like Heather's. Somehow, her openness to another reality has given her the strength to accept John's death at least with resignation. This contrast between Laura and John is important in establishing the film's attitude toward non-ordinary experience. Throughout, Laura has focused on concrete perceptions rather than abstractions or attitudes defined by the culture. For example, when asked whether she's a Christian, she replies, "I don't know. I'm kind to animals and children." She is open to explanations that contradict normal perceptions and beliefs. This helps her to accept the deaths of loved ones because in the world of the spirit, there is no rigid distinction between life and death. Don't Look Now develops another important ambiguity concerning the nature of the gift. Even if John had been able to accept his second sight, could he have escaped his death, which seems to have been ordained by fate? Does clairvoyance involve warnings of events that might not happen? Rogue intensifies this ambiguity by an emphasis on accidents that is not present in Du Maurier's story, where Christine dies of meningitis rather than drowning, and Johnny is endangered by appendicitis rather than an injury in a game. Rogue invents the opening sequence of the drowning and the immediate reactions of the parents, enabling us to see in a concrete manner that this accident evokes clairvoyant foreshadowings. Du Maurier begins the story in the Venice restaurant. He also adds the parallel slow-motion falls of Laura in the restaurant and John in the cathedral. While hers can be explained in terms of her psychological condition in reaction to Heather's psychic powers, his remains unexplained except as the workings of fate. Both accidents raise doubts about John and Laura's safety, yet it is John's that provides the true foreshadowing, the more ominous because without apparent cause. The accidents make the universe more dangerous and suggest a pattern of events that is inexorable, but only perhaps partially perceptible. Inexorable. In the restaurant before her fall, Laura says to John, "It's incredible, you can't change your course." If this is true, what is the value of the warnings? The film never resolves this question. It remains one of the many paradoxes that are offered in the place of the logical either-or thinking of Western culture. Another of Rogue's significant additions is the development of John's occupation. In the story, the couple goes to Venice for a holiday, while in the film, their visit is motivated by John's restoration work. While Du Maurier also emphasizes the decadence of the Venice environment, her focus is on the physical decay. Venice is sinking. The whole city is dying. Robberies and murders are increasing. There are many gluttonous eating scenes that make the decadence worldly and material. The psychic moments are comically deflated when juxtaposed with the eating of spaghetti. But Rogue's treatment is entirely serious. As signs tell us throughout the film, Venice is in peril. It seems a perfect visual metaphor for mysterious patterns of danger moving from past into the future. After John's clairvoyant vision as the body is raised from the canal, he crosses the Pont de Miracolo, Bridge of Miracles. Later, as he searches for the pensione, the camera reveals another sign reading Pont de Vivante, Bridge of the Living. The names suddenly attain symbolic significance, implying that the ancient city itself has supernatural powers that emerge at fated moments. Venice is not threatening to those who cannot read the signs. As Heather tells John, "One of the things I love about Venice is that it's so safe for me to walk. The sounds, my sister hates it. She says it's like a city in aspic after a dinner party, and all the guests are dead. It frightens her. Milton loved this city." Though sighted and aware of material dangers not perceived by blind prophets like Heather and Milton, John ignores the signs. His concern with restoring cathedrals allows Rogue to extend the decadence to art and religion, the world of the spirit, both of which are more closely connected with the supernatural. It also develops John's character by presenting his attachment to the traditional in art as well as in perception. As in The Exorcist, the urban environment is important in developing themes of good and evil, energy and weakness, health and corruption, order and chaos. But Friedkin uses the modern cities simply as a vehicle for mechanical enumeration of social and moral evils. In Don't Look Now, the bishop and the police inspector, both representatives of institutions that sanctify order, are developed with considerable ambiguity. Both are immediately sensitive to John's extraordinary, disturbed state of mind, almost to the point of telepathic awareness. The police inspector probes insistently to discover John's hidden fear. During their conversation, the inspector glances casually out the window at the moment when the two sisters happen to walk by. As John talks on, the inspector doodles on the eyes in the police drawing of Heather, making it look more like her. The bishop awakens suddenly at the moment of John's death. The connection between these public figures and the chain of supernatural events is also strengthened visually. The display of ecclesiastical costumes in the bishop's chamber is set against a red background. The map of Venice in the inspector's office is shaped very much like the red stain on the slide in the opening sequence. Yet at the same time, these characters are subtly undermined. The police inspector holds weird theories about visual correspondences. Age causes women to look more like each other. Men grow quite distinct, but women seem to converge. The purpose of the police artist is to make the living appear dead. When Laura informs him that the drawing does not look like Heather, he replies, "It doesn't matter." The worldly bishop makes Laura feel uneasy. John explains, it's because he makes God seem less than immaculate. After discussing mosaic tiles with the bishop, John concludes, he doesn't give an ecclesiastical fuck about churches. Thus, the police inspector's rationality is suspect, and we must question the breadth and purity of the bishop's spiritual commitment. The film's visual style confirms the existence of second sight. In contrast to The Exorcist, where ordinary and non-ordinary experience are presented in the same mode, making it easy for anyone to perceive them without struggle, Don't Look Now forces us to see in new ways and confront the problems of interpretation. Hence, the audience is placed in the same situation as the characters. Visual and auditory images work phenomenologically, as in Part 1 of The Exorcist. When image fragments constantly reappear, we look for the key in patterns and repetitions. We are confronted with photographs, drawings, portraits, slides, statues, and modern replicas of ancient mosaics. We are led into tracing their resemblances to each other and to the originals on which they are based. Thus, we acquire the habit of acute perception, which we may take out of the theater, since interpreting non-ordinary reality within the film is a matter of life and death. The editing style destroys the linear structure of the literary source. The montage of quick shots juxtaposes present with past and future. The opening sequence has a predictive value for the whole film. The first shot is of rain on the pond where Christine is soon to drown, establishing water imagery that is to permeate the film as it does the city of Venice. This image is used with verbal irony when the wife of the headmaster reassures John that his son is right as rain. The second image is unrecognizable, but later, when we see it in context, the Venice hotel room, we learn that it is light coming through a lattice window screen. In a series of quick cuts, several images become contaminated by association with Christine's death. Her red Macintosh and red and white ball, fire imagery to be repeated in the church candles, piano music which recurs when John is looking for the pensione of the weird sisters, and John's howl. Oh, my alarm went off. Stop. My alarm went off. And John's howl and Laura's scream, which are associated with the screeching drill that follows immediately, the ambiguous sounds at the sisters' hotel that could be a baby crying or a cat howling, and with the strange whimperings of the dwarf. The image of breaking glass appears at least twice during this sequence and recurs later in Laura's and John's falls. In the cathedral, a piece of wood smashes through the flimsy glass, reminding us of the book title, Beyond the Fragile Geometry of Space. Like the unbroken surfaces of the bar window, the whiskey bottles and glasses, the mirrors, and the slide, this glass functions as a screen, a metaphor for the illusions that must be shattered to confront supernatural experiences. Nothing is what it seems. The images in the slide establish the hooded dwarf, the cathedral, the color red, and the shape of the stain as signs of danger. At the end of the sequence, John rushes out to reclaim Christine's body from the pond, while Laura, behind the window, and Johnny, his finger bloodied by broken glass, look on. The visual pairings of characters predict that the next victim will be John, despite the apparent threats to Laura and Johnny. The film is framed with the deaths of Christine and John, fulfilling the prophecy of the opening. At the funeral, Laura and Johnny are reunited as spectators. Frequently, when ordinary reality is transcended, a loop style is issued to merge past, present, and future. In the ladies' room at the restaurant, we experience Heather's powers for the first time. The group of images is framed by close-ups of Heather's vacant blue eyes, which look like water. The next shot is of John's blue eyes, suggesting that he, too, has second sight. Then we see sparkling water, railings on a bridge, a close-up of Laura driving away from the house in the rain with a sad look on her face. Is this a flash backward to Christine's death, or forward to John's? Next, the camera pulls into a shot of rain on watery ground before cutting back to Heather's eyes. Second sight provides Heather with a series of images, just as Rogue provides them for us. She has to interpret what she sees to realize the connections within the montage as we do. The first time we see the film, it is difficult to recognize the autonomy of this vision because rapid cutting characterizes the whole film, but the repetition of Heather's eyes becomes the key. As John lies dying, he sees a vision that integrates all the images from Heather's vision, some from the opening and from other non-linear sequences such as the lovemaking scene and the raising of the body from the canal. The convention of the dying man's life flashing before his eyes is given new significance through its association with clairvoyance and the supernatural. John's vision of the Vaporetto is unique. Presented in longer takes with little cutting, it creates a more conventional visual reality. Paradoxically, this clarity is confusing. We, like John, are tempted to interpret this as the present, yet we have seen the pattern of the three women grouped together before, and usually juxtaposed with a child or an inanimate figure, this time John's corpse. Thus we are taught to look for patterns not only in the editing, but also in visual and verbal elements within a single shot. In the church scene, as Laura describes Christine's death to the two sisters, we see the three women in the background with a statue in the foreground, before cutting to John struggling with a gargoyle whose face reminds us of the grotesque dwarf. In the next scene, when Laura goes to visit the sisters for a seance, Rogue intercuts between John seated before 3 bottles and the 3 women seated in the room, their heads in a row as they try to contact the dead child. Over the mantel is a painting of 3 women with Christ's child. Later, when John discovers their pensione for the police, the camera dwells on this portrait as if it is a key to the mystery. This pattern establishes Laura's identification with the 2 sisters, invalidating John's kidnap theory. Potentially, it also could have predicted his own danger. His misinterpretation is compounded because he has cut himself off from the incidents in which this pattern has previously appeared. The lovemaking sequence rearranges linear reality, not to confound, but to affirm the experiential value of merging past, present, and future. At first, it seems that the lovemaking is the film's present and is being intercut with flashes forward to dressing, Laura's black pants and silver top. Then, as more time is spent on the later images, it seems that the dressing sequences are the present reality, intercut with flashes back to the lovemaking. We gradually learn that Rogue has controlled time to show the value of obscuring distinctions and to emphasize the flow, as John and Laura's bodies move together in the slow lovemaking. In this sequence, the content is part of everyday reality rather than the extremes of death or second sight. The banal and the extraordinary are also merged as the action is initiated by the most mundane of details. Laura says, "You have toothpaste on your mouth," and John replies, "Eat it off." The intense lovemaking, characterized by energy, creative variety, and full active commitment by both Laura and John, is intercut with shots of them sharing the bathroom as they get dressed. Laura puts on mascara, John winds his watch and fixes a drink. The cutting suggests that it is possible to go from the most intense to the most mundane smoothly and without emotional loss. Some of the images stress the carryover of warmth as Laura looks in the mirror admiring her own sensuality and repeating the gestures she used in making love. As they walk through the hotel lobby, glamorously dressed for the evening, Laura puts her hand on John's arm and leans her head on his shoulder affectionately. Their glowing vitality contrasts with the sterility of the shrouded hotel furniture, which signals that Venice is about to close down for the winter. In contrast to The Exorcist, which treats sex as a manifestation of decadence and evil, Rogue's film elevates it to an act of regeneration. It is a rite of passage, signaling the end of the couple's mourning for their daughter and Laura's return to full participation in life. The success of this sequence grows out of the fact that content and style are combined with an equal power that is unusual for the film. Generally speaking, Don't Look Now succeeds primarily at the perceptual level. Its emotional impact is considerably weaker. This limitation is most apparent in John's murder. Despite the vivid horror of the blood and the twitching, the seriousness of Rogue's tone is undermined by the fact that John's been done in by a killer dwarf. What a bloody, silly way to die. Despite all the visual preparation, the instrument of his death appears like a deus ex machina. In some ways, of course, the dwarf is associated with Christine, primarily through size, shape, and color. However, this association only heightens the abstraction with which the child's death is handled. As in The Exorcist, Christine and the demon become polarities of good and evil, victim and killer, but here the emphasis is on fusion, which obscures the traditional distinction. Though our perceptual skills are advanced and we may become more open intellectually to non-ordinary experience, Don't Look Now, unlike Performance and Walkabout, does not touch our deepest fantasies and needs. Further, the supernatural experiences of the film are not linked to growth towards positive ends, but to acceptance of a declining world and sudden death. In Don't Look Now, death is absurd. Laura's acceptance provides only the ability to bear her loss. Shifting from the visionary and symbolic modes of Rogue's earlier films, which both led to profound reevaluation of symbolic experience, Don't Look Now offers a low mimetic realism that is far more commercially accessible. It enables Rogue to use competent professionals like Sutherland and Christie, who are credible and appealing, but who lack the magic of rock star Mick Jagger in Performance and authentic Aborigine Gulpilil in Walkabout. The fascination of the surface is Don't Look Now's primary source of value. Involvement in human experience focuses on exploration of formal patterns that may, indeed, be unchangeable no matter how much is known about them. Both The Exorcist and Don't Look Now, in trying to affirm a basic metaphysical value and expand our spiritual reality in a world dominated by corruption and despair, draw our attention to the richness of the phenomenological surface but remain unconvincing at the deeper levels of conceptualization and emotional power. That is the end of that essay. Woof. The next movie is going to be The Eyes of Laura Mars. So that'll be something to look forward to. My throat needs a break.